Hi, on this episode of Things That Matter, I interview my friend David Zamora, pastor of Living Way Christian Fellowship in Fontana, formerly gang member and in prison and now serving Christ and having a great impact in his community. So stay tuned. Hi, and welcome to this episode of Things That Matter. I'm Brian Brodersen. It's great to be with you, and it's great to be in the studio today with my friend David Zamora. David is the pastor of Living Way Christian Fellowship in Fontana, California, and David's got a really just a wonderful testimony where God brought him from, and just a lot of great things happening in the ministry that he's involved in today. So, David, welcome.
Thanks.
Great to have you.
It's a blessing to be here.
Yeah. So I wanted to get our audience a little bit familiar with you. Some folks actually might know you from the film that we did. We did a film called The Neighborhood, and you were one of the guys featured in that film. But for those that didn't see the film, I wanted to start with just talking a little bit about your background. So you're pastoring a church now. It's a beautiful work. God's doing some really great things. But that's not where you were not all that long ago. You were in an entirely different world, a different context. Just tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the background, obviously, where I grew up was mainly gang culture, drugs, and which ultimately led to spending several years incarcerated in the prison system here in the state of California.
Yeah.
And so, but basically young, kid just trying to find, I guess, meaning, purpose, trying to fit in. And I guess within the last 5 years, 6 years, I've best described my testimony prior to coming to know the Lord as a place in my life where I feared more than anything, though others would give maybe a whole different testimony on that and say, well, he was this, he was that, he was crazy, But me, it was more of like, no, it was really fear. I feared rejection.
Yeah.
So it led me to a lot of things in life as a young kid.
So that was driving a lot of your behavior.
Yeah, exactly.
But at the time, I mean, you probably never would have, you certainly wouldn't have verbalized that, right?
Oh, no, that fear was far from my mind. Yeah. But now, looking back on the whole thing, it was more now like, you just feared, rejection.
Yeah, sure.
So it led to a lot of bad decisions.
Yeah. Now, I want to talk for just a moment about the moment of your conversion, because it's such a great story. And I'll set the background, and then you can pick up the details. So you're in prison. Mm-hmm. You've been a heroin addict for years. Mm-hmm. You've got a guy who you're in prison with, and he's been talking to you about the Lord. Mm-hmm. And then there came that kind of moment of truth. So pick up right there.
Yeah, he would tell me about Jesus, and he reminded me a lot of my mom, because she would always tell me about the Lord. So I always told him that, messing with him. Yeah. And then one day he just said, hey, you know what? In so many words, this is how he felt, the way to relate to me. He's like, I'm tired of telling you about Jesus. In other words, you're not listening. You need to make a decision. And so he asked me this question. This is what really engaged me. He just said, if there's one thing God can do to prove himself to you, what would that be? It's just his way. And I just said, I picked the hardest thing that came to mind, because I'd been in like 6 different institutions, one in the state of Texas. None of them could rehabilitate me. Yeah. So I just said my addiction to meth and to heroin, and if God can take that. And then he looks at me and he goes, so if God can take that from you, you would serve him? And I told him, I'd serve you if you took it from me. And he says, well, what do you have to lose? Yeah. And basically what happened there was later on that evening, I'm trying to go to sleep, and this conversation is just in my mind, So I just prayed. I just kind of like gave it a shot, and I said, God, it's just kind of how I address the Lord. God, if you're the God of the Bible, if you're the God that this man says you are, if you're the God that my mom says you are, because she was just like this guy, I says, then take this addiction from me. And if you do, I'll give you the rest of my life. And if you don't, I don't need you in my life, and I'll die a dope fiend. That was it.
Yeah.
And the next day I woke up completely delivered, never touched another needle since. It was radical.
Yeah.
It was a radical experience.
Yeah, yeah. That is amazing. So leading up to that, though, I mean, did you have any idea that was going to happen that night? I mean, were you thinking about this? Was this something that was kind of, you were going over in your mind, and so you wanted to be freed from the drugs? Mm-hmm. Had you ever expressed that, or was it just like a deep down sort of a cry of your heart?
The thing I will say is I think a lot of guys, from that background, there comes a point where we use the term, tired, mm-hmm. or, burned out kind of thing. And mm-hmm. basically, I think everybody gets to that point. For me, I believe it was a series of events that I realize now, looking back, that I believe God allowed to take place in my life. Mm-hmm. And one of it was I had this perspective of prison that was really, if you've been to the joint, then you've arrived, because it gave you some sense of respect every time you got out. Yeah. So things became easier for you because they say, he's an OG, or he's been to the joint, or you want that type of acceptance. Yeah. Well, here's what happened is there was things that were happening in prison that I didn't agree with, but you can't really say nothing in there. If you say you disagree with it, then you're going against the whole grain of what we call prison politics, mm-hmm. and that could get you killed in a heartbeat. Yeah. And so you just stay quiet, whether you agree with it or not. You just stay quiet. And but it was a series of events, my last prison term, that led me to start thinking, reconsidering mm-hmm. my life and the purpose, meaning, kind of things like that. And I think it started a couple of years before, when I was, facing a lot of years in prison and was acquitted on some very serious charges. Mm-hmm. And that was, I guess, in the worldly terms, lucky, but, mm-hmm. I believe now that God was already working in that. But that's what drew me to ask this question, mm-hmm. what if God is real and what my mom is saying is true? Yeah. This happened a couple of years before this prayer in prison with this inmate. Yeah. My mom went to go visit me, and I'm facing all this time, and she starts telling me, son, you're not going to spend the rest of your life in prison. So in my mind, I'm thinking, well, I know my family doesn't have money. They couldn't have afforded an attorney, mm-hmm. And she just says, no, when you were little, we went to this tent revival, and you wanted prayer. You seen people going up. You were about 5 years old. Mm-hmm. And as she started telling me the story, I started to picture it like, I remember that. Mm. Yeah, it was in that tent. She was, and then when I thought like she was going to say like, somebody there, they've always wanted to help you, and they gave us some money. And then the story started to change when she said, and you went up for prayer, and the evangelist started, giving a word over your life that you were going to, and I started to think like, this is you knowing and I got so upset with her. I said, I don't need your Jesus. I don't need you, and I got so upset, man, and told her all kinds of stuff. My poor mom, man, I put her through so much. So anyways, I ended the visit, and my buddies are like, hey, how was your visit? I go, she's talking that Jesus stuff, man. I don't need Jesus. I need an attorney. Yeah. Well, then I go to court a couple of weeks later, and they're like, you're being acquitted on these charges. And so anyways, I'm walking, after all that was done, I'm walking back to the bus to go back to the county jail, and the next thing you know, I said, it just dawned on me. Yeah. What if God is real? Wow. And what my mom is saying is true? And I think that's where it started.
That kind of really put
and it caused me to question.
The seed there, yeah. Wow.
Caused me to question. Yeah. So I think that's where I believe that's where the Lord really already got a hold of my heart. Yeah. It was just a matter of me surrendering now and saying, okay, Lord, I have nowhere else to turn but you.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So you come to Christ in your cell that night. You're delivered from the heroin addiction, and yet you're still in prison. And how'd you get out? What happened?
Well, it's funny because let me put it to you this way: your word is everything, especially when you're talking to another man, right? Yeah. But when you're talking to God, I still didn't understand who God was, right? I just figured, okay, then I prayed to the right one, I guess, But he delivered me from my addiction, and only I knew, because I knew something was changed in me. I had no desire for it, and I felt different. And so here's what ended up happening. The first thought that came to my mind was like, oh man, now I got to be a Christian in here, which is like a no-no. So, being the master manipulator that I was, I had a little bit of pull and was able to get away with certain things. So here's how I started to go to church before I was going to parole is, after that happened, I remember that I had gotten, was able to make a phone call. So I wanted to call my mom and kind of explain to her. And the first words that came out of my mouth were, "I'm sorry." And it was like dead silence. Then I just heard her crying, because I had never talked to my mom that way. And I just says, "I'm sorry for everything I've ever done." And I says, "I got to share this with you. And this guy was telling me this, and I'm praying." And then she's like, "Son," she goes, "the Lord got a hold of you." This guy said, "Well, hold on. We don't know yet. But I know something." Like, I'm trying to downplay this thing, right? And this is what's so funny. At the same time, the guard comes in, and he's like, K79941, my number, So I says, "Yeah, I'm right here," So he gives me this letter. I got my mom on the phone, and I'm opening this letter, and it's like, "Hey, stranger, hey, baby, how you been?" And I'm reading it. And my mom's like in my ear, no, you don't need no women in your life right now, kind of thing, So and so I told her, "Let me call you back."
Yeah.
There was a number. So I called the number. They accept the collect call. And it was a girl that I had met in one of my times that I think I was only out like 30 days. And I met her in between time. And so I start talking to her, and the first thing she says to me, she says, "There's something different about you." Then that really bothered me, because she met a guy who was running the streets, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So anyways, I didn't want to say it. And then all of a sudden, I just said it. I says, "Yeah, I don't know what happened. I was just talking to my mom, and I prayed this thing," and she just started bawling. And she just says, she said, "God touched you." She says, "I got saved 6 months ago at Calvary Chapel, Golden Springs. Raul Reese is my pastor." And so, and we start talking, and I'm just like, wow. And like within the next 2-3 days, her aunt's sending me all these cassette tapes of Raul Reese's teaching. And so anyways, she ended up becoming my wife. That's who I'm married to now. Right. But here's what's interesting.
I knew that was Bianca. Yes.
So what's interesting was I'm thinking, okay, I got to do something in here. And so what I did was I went out and I told the fellas, because if you start going to Bible studies, that's like a big red flag. So I said this. I says, "Hey," I told one of the guys, "Hey, you see them girls that come in to sing for the guys?" He's like, "Yeah." I go, "Hey, man, and back then you start, you look good, man." He's like, "Yeah." I go, "I'm going to get creased up. I'm going to go over there." So I was like getting ready, like I'm going to a club, man, So I go and I sit in the back, and it was so hilarious, because one of the ladies gets up there to kind of address the men. She says, "Some of you guys just come in here to stare at us, but we love you." And I'm just like sinking in my seat, kind of thing, So anyways, I started to attend that way. And began to hear the gospel and started to put, but never fully walked with the Lord in there.
Yeah. Never came out and just said, "Hey."
Well, some guys ask me, "Hey, what's going on? We see that you've been going." I just says, I think it's good for me to, to maybe sit in some studies and hear the word of God. Some of them were okay with it. Others were just like, you're crazy, man. You're getting weak.
Yeah.
Kind of that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So you paroled. God's obviously doing a work and all these different things. We'll fast forward. You and I met 10, 12 years ago, maybe, something like that.
We met in 2004, I think.
Yeah.
Right around there.
13 years.
Yeah.
Okay. And you were coming. I was teaching Saturday nights. You just started showing up with your
my wife,
family, and so we started talking. And you were telling me, you were teaching a Bible study, and then one thing led to another. And next thing you know, it looked like some kind of a church thing was going on.
Yeah.
And So now you're Pastor David.
Yeah.
And God's doing some really cool stuff
Yeah.
out there in Fontana at the fellowship. But what I want to specifically talk about, David, with that is the story that you just told about yourself. That is being repeated over and over again, in some ways through your ministry. And I was just with you a couple weeks ago. Bunch of guys out there, and they are all guys who had that similar story, that similar background. So just talk a little bit about what God's doing in that culture.
Well, one of the things is a lot of these guys, they have this mentality, once a felon, always a felon. You have on every application you filled out, have you been convicted of a felony?
Yeah.
In a sense, I kind of look at that group of guys, myself included, as the odds stacked against us. Mm-hmm. So really, when you come out of prison, the system itself tries to provide as best as it possibly can what we would call a type of orientation meeting. Perhaps they'll have providers, county officials, the welfare, whatever they can do to try to help you out. Then there'll be some churches there. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, when I came out of prison, they didn't have any of that. Mm-hmm. So it would have to be really, my family trying to help me out or me trying to plug in somewhere. So that was kind of the case for myself. I had my family and relatives that were believers, so I was able to stay connected in some way. Fast forwarding how the Lord, put me in a position where I'm at now, I took that into consideration with guys getting out the joint. Mm-hmm. So by the grace of God, I was able to become a state parole chaplain.
Yeah.
And so working with parolees, and one of my main objectives in that position was to, meet that need that was not met when I transitioned.
Yeah.
So from a pastor's perspective. So that's what I did.
Yeah.
And ultimately now I'm able to work with parolees. We opened, I believe, about 4 years ago. You came maybe a year after it was open or within the year for our recovery home. Small little 8-bed facility we have there. And so, we were able to open that up for guys that are more of a second phase, that already have a relationship with the Lord, kind of walk them through discipleship and, get their minds and their hearts right, not only with the Lord, but with themselves so that they could be that much more effective for their children, for their family. So here's one of the things. There's a lot of programs out there. Mm-hmm. I didn't want to be just another program. Yeah. I really wanted it to be a place in which the guys would learn to work hard, but not to work hard to raise money for the program. Mm-hmm. So there were certain things that I did to try to design that program where the financial burden was not on those in the program. Yeah. The financial burden's on the church. Right. It's a ministry of the church. Mm-hmm. So ultimately, there was a couple of ideas I had. One was the mentorship and discipleship. That's a huge one. The other one was work for the guys. So they work 3 days a week at the church. Mm-hmm. They're the maintenance crew. Yeah. So that appeals in that area to them. Another element was education. Yeah. And so giving them this and helping them out with their relationship with the Lord, then what starts to, I guess you can say, flee their thinking is, I'm just a convicted felon and this is as good as it gets. And then when we start talking and they meet me and they start to see like, wow, you were where I was and now look at, we see you with your family, you're pastoring the church, there's all this going on. So the hope is, Pastor David was where you were. Yeah. And this is what the Lord can do. Yeah. Yeah. And so that's what our main objective is to give them hope.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And you mentioned education in that. So you're involved with Community Christian College.
Yes, that's correct.
And have been for quite some time, because you've got a real burden to, obviously, first and foremost, you want to help these guys spiritually, make sure they're strong and, they're continuing on in their faith. But you want to help them beyond that as well. And so you feel like getting them an education is an important thing.
Yes. Yeah. I feel that it is. You can give them, the Word of God, which is important. You can teach them Bible stories and give them theology and doctrine, which is very important. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, at the end of the day, they need to learn how to be in an environment that maybe is not a biblical setting. It might be a secular job working for the the county or working for some type of in an office, where you're required to do your due diligence as far as work is concerned.
Sure.
So it's a matter now of this is what puts food on the table, and so
and these guys coming from basically a life of crime.
Yep.
Where your job was to just rob
exactly
people.
And that's the thing. What I think a lot of people don't understand is that in that culture, depending on what type of rank you have within that, the gang life, there's some guys that they're required. You have to go out and steal. You have to go out and do this. You got to produce. You got to do so much. So ultimately, that becomes second nature to us.
Yeah.
We say we're going to go come up. It's easy. It's, for us, it's not a problem. It's what we do. But to say now you're making an honest living, that statement doesn't even come across an individual in that lifestyle's mind at all whatsoever. Yeah. The first thought that comes to their mind if they lose, let's just say they get a job, a construction job. That's the common job these guys get. Yeah. They're general laborers. They're making $16, $17 an hour. I use this as an example because this was a real case. Well, for guys like that, that's some decent money. Yeah. Okay? But then they lose their job. The first thought that comes to mind is, well, I can just call so-and-so and I just got to do one run and I'll be good for 2-3 months. Yeah. You see, and that's that one thing that gets them back in.
That's a big temptation.
So what we did was we designed what is called like the 5 battery test to get your high school equivalency. We at our church wrote that ourselves. And then basically we take them through kind of like a, pre-testing for, your high school diploma. It's a certificate of completion. Yeah. And so we start with there if they've never gotten their, graduated high school or whatever. Right. Then we got an accredited college to accept it. Yeah. And so that's what really helped out tremendously. And we now have been working with most of these guys and gals, and they're able to get their Title IV funding. Then we put them into Community Christian College, the college that I've been with for about 8 years now. Yeah. And so it's been a great fit. Yeah. And then now they have opportunity once they graduate at CCC to go on to. Most of our students go on to Viola. They go on to Cal Baptist. Yeah. Some of the major 4-year Christian universities, Vanguard, they transfer out, and they would have never thought. Yeah. But one of the things that I tell them, I says, this is a part of it is education. Yeah. But another part is educating your vocabulary, educating your thought process. Knowledge is one thing. You could know a lot of stuff, but still talk like a knucklehead. And I tell them that stuff doesn't fly. Like the way you talk has to change, and sometimes they get upset with that. Because, what do you mean? Are you ashamed? I said, no, man, you can't go inside a place and do a job interview and talk like you're on the prison yard shooting the breeze with one of the fellas before you up to play handball. It doesn't work that way. You ain't gonna get a job that way. So that's another thing where sometimes they'll be talking and we tell them, hey, don't use that, and so it helps them out. And education helps, I personally believe, gives a balance to all of that.
This is a really practical side of discipleship. I mean, this is great because in the end, you're helping these guys get to a place in life where those kinds of previous temptations to just go out and do a deal or whatever, that's not no longer in their thinking process because they got this whole new thing going. Yep. That's amazing. That's awesome. I have said this. I said it in our film that we did together, and I said it numerous times. I actually said it a couple weeks ago in one of my sermons that you guys, you, and I'm talking about the other guys in the film, but that whole crew of guys that I've met, I mean, to me, you guys are, this idea that, there's no God. I mean, there's no evidence for God. I've never seen any evidence. I just say, you want some evidence for God? These guys are, you guys to me, you're like a scientific experiment. You're empirical evidence that, because your transformation cannot be explained humanly, really. It wasn't like you were sitting around going, I want to change, I want to do better, I gotta, something happened to you from the outside that came into you and changed you. And I want to close with, I want you just to quickly tell the story about when you went before that judge and he was like, wait. Now, I know David Zamora, but
Yeah.
so could we just finish up with that?
So some time into me being out of prison, I got involved a lot with the parole department, just working with parolees, kind of being the in-between. And on one of the tables of information, there's a packet there that says a certificate of rehabilitation. Mm-hmm. So there's some guidelines. I don't know why they have it at those parole meetings, because all those guys are fresh out. You got to have like 7 years off of parole. Yeah. So I grabbed it, started to look at it, and thought to myself, maybe I'll shoot for this. Mm-hmm. So I started to take the, procedures, the proper steps, and so I did. And the district attorney's office in the city where we're at gave me a call and said, we have an appointment with you. You've filed an application for, certificate of rehab. Do you understand what you're, and I'm thinking, well, I guess I can, get some things cleared. Yeah. So anyways, to make a long story short, I'm sitting with this district attorney, and we're in this room at the old courthouse. And so we're talking, and she has a couple of folders on the table. And one of them is kind of thick. The other is a folder that I had submitted with letters from the chief of police, supervisors from the parole department, people in the community. I mean, all the letters of recognition from the government center. I got the Hispanic Heritage Award. So we put all this stuff in there, right? Yeah. So she's going through it, and she looks at me, and she's asking me concerning my crimes and how long I've been out. I guess kind of getting a feel. Yeah. So ultimately she says, I do have a question. And she says, what I want to know is, how does this individual, and the folder that she put her hand on was my criminal record, my C-file from prison, everything. I was validated in the California prison system. And she says, I want to know how this individual became this individual. Wow. And so I says, well, the only way I can share that with you is if I'm able to share my faith. She had this small little recorder. She slid it all the way across the table. She says, you're on record. So I just preached the gospel, man. I just said, Jesus Christ came and he died for my sins, and so I just preached, and she was like in tears. Wow. And she was just blown away. She goes, I've never had an interview like this, ever. Amazing. So anyways, she, it was very encouraging. I got to share the Lord with her and everything. And so, and then they started their investigation. They talked to next door neighbors. They went to old addresses where I live. They just wanted to make sure, is this guy really out the mix, kind of thing. So anyways, to make a long story short, she calls me and she says, I have your report done and everything's going to be ready to be submitted. She goes, this is the process. Now that I've done my investigation, I now take it to the courthouse. And what we're going to do is we're going to motion for the judge to look at what I have here, and then I says, do I have to be there? She said, no. He'll set a court date, and that's when they'll give us the answer, yes or no. Yeah. I said, oh, okay. So she says, this day I'll be in court presenting your petition. So I says, okay, your case before the judge. I said, okay. So anyway, she goes in there, I guess, I don't know how the story goes. She explained this to me after. She said she walked in, the judge had everything there. They start looking at it. He goes, David Zamora. And she says, he thought for a little bit, and he's looking, and he goes, yeah, I know him. He goes, I just gave his uncle some time in prison. As a matter of fact, his uncle just beat a 3-strike, conviction. And it was my uncle Daniel Zamora. He was going through the process at the time with the courts. So she says, yes, that's his family. And he goes, yes. He goes, he's Ontario, a Black Angel affiliate. He goes, I remember this young man in my courtroom. He goes, as a matter of fact, he goes, he had some very choice words to say to me. He goes, and he says, he goes, hold on. He told her to hold on, and she thought maybe he was going to say this is never going to happen. He went into the judge's chambers. He comes out about 40 minutes later, and he has the certificate of rehab already approved, signed by him, and a letter motioning for a full governor's pardon on my felony convictions. He says, you don't need to come in for another court date. I'll approve it right here and there, and you tell Mr. Zamora I'm proud of him. And so it's interesting, when she called me, she was practically crying on the phone. Yeah. But what a lot of people don't realize is this was a judge that I was so upset with, because I wanted to have a little bit, buy some time, because I had something going on out. So I'm like, hey, do you think I can, turn myself in a couple of weeks. I got some personal matters that I need to take care of. He's seen right through it.
Yeah.
And he told me some things. I told him some stuff. And my mom was really upset. She was devastated.
Yeah.
So they took me in that day, and the sheriffs weren't too happy as to how I spoke to the judge. So they, gave me the fivefold ministry back there in the back, put the boots to me for a little bit. And I thought to myself, I'm going to get this judge back. Mm-hmm. And now look it, I'm going to show him. And look it, the Lord says, oh, you are going to show him. Maybe not the way you think, but, and that to me was just the Lord saying, vindicating that. Yeah.
Yeah. Amen. When I think of you, I just think of redemption. This is redemption incarnate.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us for this episode of Things That Matter. Hope you were blessed and encouraged, and the things that you hear us talking about on here, maybe this translates into some aspect of your life or ministry, and we pray that it does. And so spread the word around, get the program out, and until next time, God bless you.